The buggy stood in the corner of Jacob Lapp's barn like a question God had yet to answer. At first, no one dared touch it. Covered in burlap and dusted with straw, it sat where the cows once fed, silent and black, its spoke wheels crusted with dried mud from a world that did not belong to theirs. Jacob, now 60, watched it daily, never speaking its name. The winter winds of 1791 howled across the ridge lines, whistling through the crooked planks of the barn, but nothing shook the buggy. It stood as if it had grown there. The day it arrived had not been planned. Miriam, Jacob's only surviving daughter, had been gathering herbs in the woods when she stumbled upon a wagon accident just west of the Black Ridge stream. A young boy, no more than 7, had fallen from the cart, gashing his thigh deeply on a rusted blade meant for clearing trees. His father, a traveling English doctor named Whitlock, was shouting, panicked, blood soaking his breeches. Miriam, raised on poultices and root medicine, acted without hesitation. She stitched the boy's leg with thread drawn from her own apron and held him steady as he screamed into the pines. Whitlock, humbled and amazed, stayed in the valley for 3 days afterward, bringing not just gratitude but something more, an offering. On the 4th morning, just as the fog lifted from the meadow, his servant led the horse-drawn buggy into their yard. It was simple in form but unfamiliar in soul, high wheels, a small seat, leather harnesses polished to a sheen that caught the sun like a mirror. For you, the doctor had said, eyes heavy with meaning. You saved my son. Let this save your back. Jacob had said nothing, only nodded and stepped back as the doctor rode off, the hoofbeats fading behind a silence that felt both sacred and cursed. Word of the buggy spread faster than fire in dry hay. By that afternoon, 3 elders had visited, no to admire it, but to inquire, what was Jacob's intention? He had no intention. Not yet. But the ordnung, their sacred code of conduct, had always been clear: pride was poison, and technology a gateway to it. Yet Jacob, now deep in the weariness of old age, felt no pride when he looked at the buggy, only conflict. Every step from his home to the meeting house grew harder each year. His knees swelled after field work. His wife Elsbeth had died decades ago giving birth to stillborn twins, and Miriam, now in her 30s, was unmarried, tending goats and earth with the same still patience as her father. The buggy could make their lives easier. But was ease ever holy? For a week, Jacob prayed. He walked each day past the buggy as though it were not there, but each time, his eyes betrayed him. He remembered his cousin Elias, bold, brilliant Elias, who had once brought a cart into the community, only to be shunned and exiled when he refused to give it up. Elias had said, "A will is not temptation. It is a tool." And Jacob, back then, had replied, "A tool used wrongly can rebuild Babylon." But now, standing with pain in his spine and silence in his house, he wondered, was he rebuilding Babylon, or surviving Eden? On the 8th day, a storm broke across the valley, rain falling in heavy sheets. Jacob tried to reach the mill on foot to help a neighbor with his flood-drenched grain, but halfway there, he slipped in the clay, tearing the muscle in his leg. Miriam found him hours later, shivering, covered in filth. She fetched the town physician, not Whitlock, but an old Quaker, and nursed her father by lantern light. The next morning, Jacob sat in the barn alone, facing the buggy. It was not pride that stirred in him then. It was sorrow for the distance he could no longer walk. Sorrow for the faith that had made him strong but rigid. Sorrow for a daughter who might carry too much. Alone. He stood, limping, and ran his hand along the seat. The leather was cracked but soft. The wheels spun evenly. The reins, braided with care, bore the marks of use but not abuse. It was not a vehicle of vanity. It was a gift. That Sunday, Jacob arrived at meeting in the buggy. No words were spoken. Every bonnet turned. Every broad-brimmed hat tilted in quiet disapproval. But Jacob said nothing. He parked it beneath a cedar tree and entered the hall as he always did, slow and solemn. After worship, 3 elders stood beside the buggy, their faces carved from stone. "You brought the world into the fold," one said. "I brought myself," Jacob replied. "Nothing more." "You rode," another said. "We walk, because we choose to walk. Because Christ walked." Jacob nodded. "And I walked, too. Until I could not." The third elder, a woman named Liz, stepped forward. Her eyes were kind. "If it is necessity, we may understand. But it must not become fashion." Jacob turned and pulled from his satchel a brush and a can of pitch. Before the eyes of the community, he painted the buggy dull. Every shine was dulled. The trim turned to ash. The once proud would now look like driftwood pulled from the sea. "Let it not catch the eye," Jacob said aloud, "but serve the tired feet." The elders said nothing more. In the weeks that followed, whispers turned to silence. The buggy became routine. Miriam used it to fetch supplies for mothers in childbirth. Jacob rode only on Sundays. Others took notice, not of its style, but its service. A widow with 4 children borrowed it. A crippled boy rode in it to gathering. Slowly, what had once seemed heresy became invisible. And thus, not with argument or revolution, but through quiet use and humble repair, the horse and buggy entered the Amish world, not as a mark of pride, but as a concession to mercy. Jacob never sought approval. He sought only balance. He spent his final years reading scripture by lantern light, watching his daughter teach young girls the art of healing, and walking only when he could. When he died, Miriam Bury ed him not with the buggy, but beside her mother, beneath a simple stone. The buggy was passed on, repainted, reshaped, and eventually remade into a new one. And so the era began, not in triumph, but in trembling. Not in the noise of change, but in the stillness of adaptation. The wheel did not roll into their lives with thunder. It creaked in on quiet prayers. It began not with a sermon or a storm, but with the sound of wheels crunching gravel in the early morning mist, 2 crude oxen yoked to a flatbed cart groaning through the fog, and standing behind it, with a proud hand on the reins, was Elias Lapp, cousin to Jacob, once a boy who played in the wheat fields with bare feet and a heart soft as bread dough, now a man hardened by ambition no one yet dared to name. It was the spring of 1774, 5 years since Jacob and the others had carved a life from the bones of Lancaster's wild meadows, a life built on the ordnung, unwritten, unwavering, sacred, and while some in the community had whispered of tools and wagons and what the Mennonites used over the hills, no one had dared break the chain of obedience forged through exile, trial, and quiet perseverance. Elias, however, saw things differently, always had, ever since his return from a trip to the miller's town, where he spent 2 nights among craftsmen who bore no shame in wheels and pulleys and iron, and though he said little upon his return, his eyes had grown sharper, as if he saw something hidden in the world the rest refused to admit existed. When he brought the cart into Blackridge, the first response was not outrage, but silence, a silence thick and humming, the kind that doesn't speak because it's not yet sure how to respond, like a body pausing before fever, and Jacob felt it in his chest like a second heartbeat, for he knew Elias too well, knew his stubborn streak, knew how charm could disguise rebellion, knew how loose faith and pride could sit side by side in a man's soul. The cart was not elegant, not sleek or polished, but it was efficient. And when Elias pulled it up beside the community's shared grain barn, hauling sacks with ease, the old men squinted from beneath their brims, their hands idle on shovel handles, while younger boys watched wide-eyed, their fingers twitching to try it. Elias smiled but said nothing, and that silence, more than words, carried a challenge. Within days, he had fashioned a crude seat atop the flatbed and began taking his family to the gathering in it. oxen clopping slowly beside the foot-walking congregation, and still no one spoke aloud, but Jacob saw the glances, at the cart, at the shoes of the men trudging in dust, at the clean folds of Elias's Sunday shirt. The ordnung was not law written on paper, it was breath and memory, passed from elder to elder like fire cupped in callous hands, but the cart had no place in it, for the ordnung demanded separation from the world, and the world, Jacob knew, moved on wheels. Still, others began to speak in cautious tones, it's only pulled by animals, no different than a plow, or is it vanity if it serves the community, or did not Christ ride into Jerusalem on a beast, too? And Jacob, who had lost his wife and first son in the same bitter winter 3 years past, felt the old ache of grief return, not from loss of flesh but loss of unity, for what they had built in this valley had been born not of comfort but conviction, not of speed but stillness, and the cart, innocent as it looked, threatened to undo it all by making life just easy enough to forget why they had chosen hardship in the first place. One morning, Jacob approached Elias, finding him repairing the harnesses beside the blacksmith's shed, sweat on his brow and pride in his spine, and he asked softly, "What do you hope this brings?" To which Elias replied, "Time, not for myself, but for the Lord," and while the words were clean, the tone was not, for Jacob saw the glint behind them, the desire not only for time but for recognition, for subtle ascension. It was then the elders called a council, not in anger but in alarm, and gathered beneath the walnut tree outside the meeting house, where decisions were made slowly and with gravity. Jacob sat among them, silent at first, while Elias stood in the clearing like a man on trial, his hands clasped behind his back, his children behind him, eyes sharp, waiting to see if their future would carry wheels or weight. The debate was not of scripture but of slope, of how small deviations, well-meaning and useful, could slide into larger allowances, and how once wheels were accepted, wagons would come, then ironwork, then the need for roads, and eventually the interdependence on towns, markets, clocks, and all the trappings they had left behind in Europe when they fled the chains of state and church control. Elias argued, calmly but firmly, that the cart was not for fashion, but for faith, that with it he could carry more, serve faster, spare the backs of the elderly, and that even Christ did not demand his followers walk barefoot across every hill. Jacob finally spoke, not loudly, not with anger, but with the weight of mourning, and said, "It is not the thing itself, Elias, but what it invites. A cart may save our backs, but it may cost our souls, and the soul of a people is slower to heal than the body of a man." And with that, the council voted, not unanimously, but decisively, no wheeled carts would be permitted in daily life, for their use tethered them to a world whose values grew apart from God's. The next morning, Elias was gone, no formal farewell, no slammed doors, only the sight of his cart's tracks vanishing down the wooded road toward the Mennonite settlement, and with him went 4 families, some in silence, others weeping, the fabric of the community torn like cloth at the seam, and Jacob stood in the wake of their departure with a heaviness he would carry for the rest of his days. Not because he doubted the council's wisdom, but because he knew that a line had been drawn, and once drawn, lines cannot be easily erased. The remaining community returned to walking, to hauling by hand, to gathering wood with sleds pulled by rope, and while the air was still rich with prayer and peace, there was also a loss among them, not just of numbers, but of a kind of innocence, for they had faced a test not of survival but of identity, and in choosing discipline, they had also chosen solitude, a deeper separation that left its mark not in bitterness, but in a quiet ache. And when Jacob walked past the oxen yoke hanging unused behind the barn, he did not resent Elias, but remembered him, remembered the boy who once wept over a broken bird's wing, now gone to build a life perhaps not wrong, but simply elsewhere, under a different ordnung. And so the years passed, and the Amish of Black Ridge continued on their path, barefoot when they could be, horsebound when they must, and always wary of the sound of wheels, for in the rhythm of footfalls they believed there lived a kind of holiness that machines could never mimic. Jacob Lapp was no longer the man who had crossed the ocean with fire in his eyes and soil beneath his fingernails. In the year 1791, he moved slower, more like a man carved from the land itself, his back bent from decades of wheat cutting, his beard silvered and long, his hands the shape of labor and prayer, and as winter whispered once again across the Black Ridge Valley, Jacob found himself not fearful of the frost, but of the silence that had begun to nest inside him, the kind that comes not from solitude, but from the weight of memory, the kind that swells in the heart when change arrives too quietly to be stopped. It was on one of those still mornings, when fog clung to the fence posts and the chickens refused to stir, that the buggy came, not rolling through the village in triumph, but appearing at first light, hitched behind a stranger's wagon, unannounced, as if dropped by the hand of Providence or temptation itself. Miriam had not told her father it was coming, because she had not known herself, or the doctor had not promised it, only thanked her for saving his child, only bowed his head low the way Englishmen did when their pride had been broken by love or terror. Days earlier, Miriam had found the boy bleeding near the river bend, a white gash across his thigh from a fallen blade meant to harvest underbrush. His screams like an animal's had drawn her through the trees, and though her hands trembled, her mind did not falter. She'd used thread torn from her own apron, crushed yarrow for the bleeding, sung the hymn her mother once sang in labor, and held the boy's head against her shoulder while his father, a traveling English doctor named Whitlock, stood helpless, whispering prayers half in Latin, half in dread. The boy lived, and Whitlock, overcome with a gratitude deeper than language, returned 3 days later with a gift, a buggy of deep black walnut, polished smooth, fitted with leather seats stitched with care, its wheels carved with steadiness, not ostentation, and he left it in the lap barn without ceremony, tipping his hat to Jacob, who stood motionless as stone, and to Miriam, whose eyes widened with both wonder and horror, for they knew this was no ordinary gesture. This was a question, and maybe a test, and the kind that mattered more to the soul than to the law. Jacob said nothing for hours, only ran his hand along the buggy's frame after the doctor had gone, his fingers trailing down its curves like a man feeling the back of a mirror, seeing himself, but distorted. For days, he did not speak of it, did not ask Miriam why she had helped, because the answer was plain: she had helped because she was Amish, because she was Lapp, because her mother Elsbeth, God rest her, had once whispered that the world's cruelty could only be met by gentle hands, but now those gentle hands had brought something into their world that could not be undone, something made of wheels, wood, and a future they were never meant to meet head-on. The buggy sat in the back of the barn like a sin that had yet to be confessed, silent, inert, but alive with the weight of what it might become, and each day, Jacob passed it as he tended the goats, split firewood, or sat to mend the fence Miriam had failed to repair, and each night, he watched the wind move across the valley as he read by candlelight, his Bible open to the book of James, where faith without works is dead, and works without humility, perhaps even more so. By the 5th day, word had spread, first through whispers in the blacksmith's shop, then through quiet murmurs during quilting, then in the glances shared at market between elders whose eyebrows spoke more than their mouths dared. The buggy had not yet moved, and already it traveled fast. Some said it should be burned, that it was a temptation wrapped in wood and metal, that it would lead to pride, to roads, to envy, to the kind of comfort that breaks the soul slowly. Others were quieter, unsure, saying perhaps it was a tool, like a plow or a lantern, and only dangerous if loved too much. Miriam wept the first time someone cursed her for it, an older woman named Ada who had once shared her mother's milk during famine, now turning her back in shame, and Jacob, seeing his daughter cry in the barn where her act of mercy had been twisted into shame, felt the first crack of fury rise in his chest. Not toward Ada, not even toward the community, but toward the uncertainty he could no longer command. He sat that night staring at the buggy until the candle burned to the wick, and then longer, until dawn crept in through the slats and the frost rose silver on the roof beams, and by then, his decision had ripened like winter wheat. If the buggy was to be judged, it must be judged by its use, not its essence. The next morning, he rose before first light, took a pot of pitch, and a bundle of old cloth, and slowly, painfully, rubbed every surface of the buggy until its polish dulled, its trim lost all shine, and the pride it had worn like a crown became as humble as soot. He cut away the leather tassels, hid the brass buckles, painted the wheels gray, then, with trembling hands and breath short from age, he hitched their old gelding to the front, stepped into the buggy, and rode the 3 miles. To meeting, his back aching but his hands steady, passing neighbors who stared with wide eyes and questions they could not yet form into words. He parked beneath a cedar tree, walked with his cane into the meeting house, and sat with his head bowed. No one spoke during worship, for the Amish pray in silence first, and the silence that day was deeper than any before, not stillness, but confrontation, a gathering of hearts struggling with the same question: was this the beginning of their undoing, or a necessary grace? Afterward, 3 elders approached him outside, the wind picking up around their cloaks, their faces stern, not cruel, but concerned in the way that fathers become when they fear their sons have strayed. One asked, "Did you ride here, Jacob?" And Jacob answered, "I did." And the second asked, "Do you believe God approves of wheels?" To which Jacob replied, "I believe God approves of care, and my feet no longer carry me far enough to offer it." And the third, a woman named Lise who had buried 2 sons and carried more truth in her silence than most did in speech, said only, "Then let it not shine." And Jacob nodded, already knowing that the shine had long been stripped. In the weeks that followed, no ruling was made, no decree issued, but the buggy remained, and more than that, it began to serve. Miriam used it to carry soup to widows during the flu outbreak, to bring blankets to the tanners, to ferry an old man whose legs had failed to the baptism of his first grandson. No one praised it, no one celebrated it, but no one asked it to leave either. Its wheels became familiar, its sound no longer shocking, and in time, the blacksmith built another, plainer one, and a second elder allowed one for his arthritic wife. And though there were still those who frowned, the frowns faded into other concerns as life returned to its slow, deliberate rhythm, altered, but not broken. Jacob never spoke of it again, never argued or defended, simply rode it only when needed, walked when he could, and read every night by firelight, the buggy parked in the barn beneath a prayer he never said aloud. When he died 5 winters later, his beard white as snow and his hands folded over the same Bible he had carried across the sea, Miriam buried him beside Elsbeth, without marker, as was their way, and she left the buggy to the next family whose child was too sick to walk, whose roof had caved from snow, whose need outpaced their legs. And so the era began, not with thunder, not with defiance, but with a single act of mercy carried on 4 quiet wheels through a valley that had always tried to resist time, and perhaps, by embracing it just enough, learned to remain itself in a world forever rolling forward.